We have a special guest today, Jason Furman. He is the former chair of the National Economics Council during Obama administration. Jason, welcome to Bloomberg HD.
Good to be with you.
First question is, what's your expectation from the next month Fed meeting? Do you think Fed is on the right track?
I think that the Fed is going to raise rates at their next meeting. I don't think it will be their last rate increase this year. I think there will be a few more to come. And I think they're roughly on the right track. Inflation is quite stubborn. What they've done so far is not enough. I think they understand that, and I think they're going to do more.
And is the Fed right against inflation destabilizing the banking system? How do you see the future of the banking system?
Right. So the United States has had a few notable bank failures in the last few months. The most famous of them being Silicon Valley Bank, but also First Republic and Signature Bank. I think all of those banks were very badly managed. Their management was taking large risks. I think they were badly supervised. The regulators in charge of looking at them were not stopping them from taking the risks. And certainly higher interest rates created a challenge for those banks. But if they were well managed and well supervised, they would have had no problem surviving that challenge. I think the good news is that banks now are much more aware of the risks they're facing. The supervisors who are examining those banks are much more aware of those risks. And so I think hopefully most of the serious banking problems are now behind us. And ultimately, the best way to have a stable financial system is for the Fed to get macro policy right and get inflation under control.
And also, there is still discussion on the inflation globally. Are we in a global recession given today's economic and market environment? What is your expectation from a global perspective within 6 to 12 months?
Right. Inflation is very high everywhere. To some degree, it depends on policy choices. To some degree, it's a genuine global phenomenon. And it's going to take a while to get that under control. I think central banks around the world are going to have to raise interest rates more. So far, I do not think we're in a global recession. It's possible that some parts of the world, like Europe, are in recession. I don't think the United States is. But ultimately, the biggest question economically is, can you get inflation out of the system without causing a recession? Historically, that has not been possible to do. Maybe we'll get lucky this time, but I'm nervous.
And also related to inflation, the oil prices have gone up globally, and we see the OPEC Plus members' decision, and they make a decision on cutting the oil production. So with that, how do you broader trend of energy transition indicate an inflationary path?
Yeah, well, oil prices went up a lot when Russia invaded Ukraine. They've actually broadly come down since then. You know, they go up and down here and there for different reasons. But broadly speaking, I think what OPEC Plus did was because they were nervous that the price was too low, nervous about what that meant for the budget of countries like Saudi Arabia. And so they're trying to get the price back up, but they're not being super successful in it. Low oil prices, of course, higher ones speed up the energy transition, lower ones slow that energy transition down. But the biggest part of the energy transition is going to be the shift away from coal, which is the biggest source of carbon emissions.
And when we look at Russia's recent development, Wagner rebellion, do you think that it would trigger oil and gas prices?
So far, global markets have not responded much to what looks like it was a mutiny that took place in Russia. Largely, it looks like the situation has not fundamentally changed. There's still a conflict in Ukraine. The conflict still looks roughly the same way it is. I think the main development in Russia, Ukraine that would change global oil prices would be if Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon. I really, really hope they don't do that. I don't expect them to do that. But the tail risk for the global economy and a much more serious tail risk for global stability would be if the nuclear taboo is broken on the battlefield.
And my last question, and you had an excellent article on green industrial policy. So what does the shift towards green industrial policy mean for the energy transition? How would that shift manifested for the Biden administration?
Yeah, the United States is undertaking a very ambitious effort to subsidize clean energy. That's led to what appears to be a dramatic increase in investments in wind, solar, and other forms of renewable energy. And I think the US effort is actually going to lower the price of those technologies, which will make it easier for other countries around the world to adopt those green technologies. Now, none of this is enough to deal with the full magnitude of the threat of climate change, but I think it's a really, big step forward.
Jason, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.